Okay, so the first thing that we want to actually lay down is that consciousness, I'll denote it with C. So C denoting consciousness. So consciousness is a function of, I'll denote, okay, let me just say thoughts and emotions, right? So consciousness is a function of thoughts and emotions, which is something that we have already explained, right? But because consciousness is a function of thoughts, so F just means function of thoughts and emotions, we know that consciousness is a function of thoughts and emotions, but so far we do not know how to express this mathematically, right? We do not know how to express this in a mathematical way that will allow us to actually agree that this is actually how we tend to think and feel about things, right? So the idea now is to actually come up with a basic mathematical expression of consciousness, right? So to do this, we need to go back to the basics. Okay, so going back to the basics, we can start with a pure thought. Now, basically, when we say pure thought, all we mean is it's a particular thought that is not associated with any belief about it. Like, for example, when you talk of life, all we know is that life is the ability to live, to experience, when you're experiencing certain things and all that, that is basically life, right? Existence is life. So the opposite of life is death. So these two things are pure thoughts. In that we are not saying anything about life, all we are doing is acknowledging what it is, right? Like, for example, if we try to associate life with a belief, we may say something like life is bad or life is good. So people's perception will vary about life depending on which side they actually prefer to associate their life with, right? So at this point, when we say a pure thought, a pure thought is one which is not associated with any belief about it. Now, in this regard, a pure thought boils down to the idea that everything in life is neutral, right? There is nothing bad and good in life. Ideally, our perception of things is what defines what things are, right? For example, your perception of life, depending on your experiences, is what defines what life is for you, not for others, right? So for example, if someone has a perception that life is bad, then basically that is their belief that life is bad, right? But because someone defines life as bad, that does not imply that you also feel or define life as bad. Unless you guys have got the same kind of thinking, or maybe some, probably because you may have the same life experiences, but someone else feels that those experiences are bad, therefore life is bad. So we cannot assume that because you have certain experiences, you guys are going to have the same perception about life. So that is basically the idea about a pure thought. Now, since we have pure thoughts, and ideally in reality, every person has a direction, right? Because you cannot exist being static, but rather we exist by having directions. Like, for example, you remember when I was showing you different states of matter are associated with different motions, right? Same applies to human beings. Because consciousness is a state of matter, consciousness also has certain kinds of motions that it undergoes. And these motions can vary from one individual to another depending on their depending on belief systems, or their belief systems, how they vary. So in this regard, life, the description about life may vary from one individual to another. And therefore, that is why when we begin with a pure thought, we more like neutralize every belief system to try and come up with a universal way of the way things actually are. So in this regard, because we have to take a direction, it means that the idea about life as a pure thought can either be perceived to be bad or good. Right? So this means that the idea about life can be described as life is bad or life is good. You see that, right? So this is how reality actually is. Because in reality, we all have a perception of life. We all have a perception about how life actually is. So people who have different perceptions depending on their life experiences. So you realize that we cannot assume neutralness all the time. Because of the principle of motion, it is by fact that people who always have a perception about things, because when it comes to consciousness, perception is direction, right? So remember that in physics, we know about scalar quantities and vector quantities. So you realize that vectors have both magnitude and direction, and scalar is just magnitude, right? Same applies to consciousness. For consciousness, it has to be a vector, right? Because consciousness will give us that extent will give us options that we can choose with regards to what we perceive should be the case. So, for example, you cannot survive without a perception, because a perception is what determines the direction you take under certain conditions or circumstances. Because if you do not have a perception, then you are not likely to make any action in reality. And if you can't make any action in reality, it means that if you find yourself in a circumstance where certain things are maybe positioned to harm you, you may not respond to those things because you do not know whether they are doing something bad to you or they are not doing anything something bad to you. So you need to know, you need to have a perception. And mostly as human beings, we have been created in such a way that we try to avoid anything that can harm us. So we respond in a particular way. So a perception is important to give you the direction you should take given certain circumstances. So, for example, we have a pure thought, which is life, and we have these beliefs about life, which can vary from one individual to another. Life is good, life is bad, and life is good. So now in Thoughtmetrics, we can denote life as q to the exponent t. Now here we are just denoting life in this particular way. So t means thought, right? And q just means, well, it's a magnitude, it's a quantity, right? It is something, right? Something that is occupying space, right? Now, when we talk of space, we're talking of space in consciousness, right? So, ideas occupy space in consciousness, right? So, anything that you know about certain things are occupying your consciousness, right? So, now, in this regard, if we denote life as q to the exponent t, And this is basically a pure thought because it is not associated with any belief. However, so we bring down the equal sign and say life is bad. So now when we say life is bad, we know here that the motion or the direction about life is towards the negative, because something bad is something that is associated with negative emotions, right? So it is going towards the negative, right? So meaning that we can denote life is bad as q to the exponent t, and we're going to actually put d2. Now, why do I do this? D means descriptive, right? Now remember, T means thought. So basically, when we say QT and we put D2 down here, or the subscript, we are simply saying that if life is bad, then we are denoting this as a descriptive thought that is associated with the idea that life is bad. So same applies. So we say O, then we put QT and D1. Since we called this D2, then this becomes D1. Now, what is with the numbering, right? So this is D2 and this is D1. I started with life is bad and we're denoting it as QT D2. Why didn't I denote it as QTD1? Because I started with this one. The reason being is that normally we want to go for the idea, the positive. We want to go for the positive. So the first one is better off denoted as life is good, because it being the first one is the first priority. That's what you want. You want life to be good, right? If anything, you are given options, choose between a bad life or a good life, you're obviously going to say you want a good life. So logically, it makes more sense to just denote life is good as a descriptive thought 1, right? Then life is bad, descriptive thought 2. It is more like saying I love a good life. Otherwise, it could be the other way around, where the life is bad, right? So in this regard, this is how we can denote this. So now all we have, let me just rewrite this